Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dasa West, the Vice President of Community Impact at the Denver Foundation. We're so pleased to have you joining us here for our policy issue briefing. This session is designed to showcase why Fair Tax Colorado is so important to our region, and we're so happy to have you all joining us. Just a few webinar logistics. The first is that this session will be recorded. So if you prefer, please feel free to turn off your camera. We also want to let you know that all of you will be muted until we get to the Q&A portion of the program. So while the presentation is going on, if a question occurs to you that you want to make sure that we're answering, please just put that in the chat and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can after the presentation is done. After the presentation, we'll open up the audio and the chat will continue to be available for Q&A. I would say chat is probably the best way to ask your questions. So continue to use that as the way to communicate with us. But before we start our presentation, I'd like to turn it over to our President and CEO, Javier Alberto Soto, just to say a few words in opening.
Thanks very much, Dasa, and thank you all for joining us today. We are hoping today for a robust conversation about an issue that is so critical to the future of our state. You know, just by way of background and just to set the stage for today, I think we're all well aware that the world is in crisis. I think we also understand that national is broken. And what I mean by that is that the ability for national institutions and bodies to drive solutions just isn't working the way that perhaps it did many years ago, decades ago, but certainly not today, for a number of different reasons. So what that means in my mind is a new era of new localism, where solutions are driven at the state and local level. And frankly, oftentimes they're sparked by something called new power. New power meaning organizations, movements, peoples that are outside of the traditional power centers, legislatures, school boards, etc. These are often grassroots movements, but again, sparked by individuals, by citizens who understand that we can't wait for national to solve our problems. We've got to solve our problems at the local level, at the state level. And frankly, I think citizens' petitions embody this idea of new power quite perfectly. This is about people coming together to propose solutions to our problems and then present them to their fellow citizens for an up or down vote. Community foundations, I believe, are perfectly positioned to play an important role in driving these solutions at the local level because we are embedded in the local. Community foundations throughout America have their finger on the pulse of what's going on in community, what's going on in their states, better than most entities and organizations do. Public policy often serves as the vehicle to deliver hope to communities. And so I think that idea of hope is one that we should grab onto as we work through this issue briefing and as we consider all of the issues that will be presented to us as voters in just a few short months. Because these solutions that are driven at the local level really at the end of the day are meant to deliver hope, to provide hope to communities who are struggling, who have real problems and need real solutions. So given the role that policy plays in delivering that hope, I think it's important to note that tax policy probably is the one area above all others that is most directly impactful to individuals. And it's also one, frankly, that most clearly identifies a society's values. And so that's why we felt that it was really critically important that we talk about this issue today. In general terms, I would say that at the Denver Foundation, what we hope to create is a civic commons, a marketplace of ideas where we provide a platform to have this exchange of ideas. Understanding that this exchange of ideas is not a one-way street. We want true dialogue, true debate, because it's in that exchange of ideas that we can truly craft effective solutions that can be crafted, developed, and implemented for the benefit of everyone who calls this place home. So that's our goal for today. And so by way of just setting the stage, I want to now turn it over to Desa again, who will introduce the speakers. But just to underscore that exchange of ideas point, I hope that this develops into a really robust conversation. We will have plenty of time for dialogue, questions, comments from everyone participating today. And we hope you join us in that civic commons. Thank you.
Thanks, Javier, for those words. I'm going to now introduce our two esteemed panelists and share a little bit of their biographies with you because they're quite impressive. Our first speaker is Carol Hedges. She is the Executive Director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute, which supports tax and budget policies that advance equity and economic prosperity. Since moving from DC to Denver in 1996, Carol has served in the administration of Governor Roy Romer and worked with the Piton Foundation and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. For the Bell Policy Center, Carol authored 10 Years of Tabor, which articulated the consequences of harsh tax and spending limitations. Carol co-created the Colorado Fiscal Institute in 2013. She has a law degree from the University of Kansas and a degree in public affairs from Emporia State University. So let's all give her a quiet welcome. The other person that we'd like to welcome is Scott Wasserman. Scott is the president of the Bell Policy Center and Bell Action Network, which is dedicated to fiscal reform, education policy, economic security, and other issues that affect Coloradans. Scott served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor John Hickenlooper and Chief of Staff to both Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia and Lieutenant Governor Donna Lynn. In the governor's office, he advised on healthcare, education, and workforce development. Scott has worked as a lobbyist and served in leadership positions with SEIU, Colorado Winds, and the Colorado House Minority Office. Scott graduated from George Washington University with a bachelor's in Middle East Studies. So I'll turn it over now to Carol and Scott to provide us with a presentation.
Thank you, Desa. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I have to participate in this dialogue that, as Javier said, is so critically important for the state of Colorado. We're going to be talking today specifically about Initiative 271, which is called Fair Tax Colorado. And from the perspective of my organization and from the perspective of Fair Tax Colorado, and I'm a member of the governance team for this initiative, we know that we believe that this is the tax, the fair tax that Colorado actually needs. I'm going to hit my timer so that I don't go too long. Okay, so I want to just provide a little bit of context before we jump into the initiative itself. Currently, Colorado spends over $2,100 less than the national average in per pupil K-12 spending. And that inadequate funding means fewer opportunities to address the unique needs of our students. We know that there's not a one-size-fits-all kind of a situation. We know that's really what it takes. That's the best educational opportunity for any child. And inadequate funding means that we're just not able to do that for kids who may need a little bit more specialized kind of education. The cost of higher education has increased by over 60% since 2008. It's making tuition growth here in Colorado faster than in all but 6 states. And we know that tuition equals a really high percentage, almost a third of the average household income for Black and Latinx students here in the state of Colorado. And as increasingly more and more jobs need higher education, we know that we're leaving more and more students behind or straddling strapping them with the kind of debt that makes it really difficult to take on the education beyond high school. The other thing that's really important to remember about our tax system is in Colorado, we make those making the least pay the highest percentage of their income in taxes. That's because of the interaction between our heavy reliance on sales taxes and property taxes to fund government services in the state of Colorado. And so while we have a single rate income tax at the state level, it doesn't offset the impact of those other kinds of taxes on low and moderate income families. And of course, I think this goes without saying, but I think it's an important point to note, and especially of interest for for many of us on this call, and that is that the Coloradans of color, our Latinx and Black neighbors, or ourselves, if we're within those racial categories, the folks of color are overrepresented in the lower income categories, which means they tend to be paying the highest percentage of their income in taxes. Now, Colorado, there's a lot of structural barriers. While Javier was absolutely right, and I appreciate the introduction that the citizens initiatives are a really great way for citizens to be a part of what goes on and a part of policymaking. It is really, there's some real structural barriers to the process. And so a group of organizations came together back in 2015 to try to figure out how to overcome some of those barriers for the purposes of getting real tax reform on the ballot. But we know the drafting process itself, it requires a lot of legal time. I can't tell you the number of hours of just lawyer time we spent getting these ballot measures addressed. You have to draft many of them. It's a cumbersome process. The Tabor Amendment requires some interesting language. It has to start, shall taxes be increased. One of our good colleagues in the governance team likes to talk about, this is the language that shouts at you at the ballot. It's in capital letters, it's in bold, and it's all focused on how much money is going to be raised. And quite frankly, when you're looking at something like we see with 271, where it says, shall taxes be increased by $2 billion, a lot of voters just throw up their hands at that point and stop and say, man, I can't afford to pay $2 billion. And so that means that we have to do a real communication strategy with a lot of different voters in order to overcome that barrier. We also know that results of a recent constitutional amendment, any amendment to the Constitution requires that we collect signatures from all 35 Senate districts, and we have to get signatures equal to 2% of the registered voters in all 35 of those Senate districts. Now, if we were adding language to the Constitution, it would require a 55% vote. In this case, we're not adding language, and so it's only a single, it requires a simple majority, but it's important to remember that we've imposed a lot of restrictions on our ability to amend our Constitution. And finally, and absolutely not the least important, is this is very much a pay-to-play system. That there's a romantic notion that a group of engaged individuals could write a ballot measure and simply have it presented to all of the voters and everyone would have their opportunity to weigh in. But this system requires at a minimum, even in a good year without the complications we've seen in 2020, somewhere between $2 and $12 or maybe $20 million to successfully launch a statewide ballot campaign. As I mentioned earlier, an organization called Vision 20 came together back in 2015, and we had the vision of a fairer tax system for Colorado. We began to design at that point what we would need to have in place to win in 2020. And one of the things that we felt really strongly about is that we had to build from a set of principles. And this is the list of the principles that we designed to when we looked at developing the 271 provision. It wasn't the only one considered. In fact, at one time we had over 36 different ballot measures being considered, but all of them were evaluated through a system of making this, or through a set of principles to make our system more equitable, more stable, more adequate, more competitive, and more flexible. 271 is the product of a community engaged process. We designed through Vision 2020 multiple community engagement tools, and we heard from over 1,000 Coloradans who actually weighed in with their views on which was the best proposal and why. We conducted a statewide phone poll, and then we did a statewide online poll before we decided and picked 271, which was a product of all of this input. Again, so we were moving forward, and we had identified the need for additional revenue, more adequate, more fairly raised, et cetera. And then we were met with the unexpected and truthfully, we all know, inability to plan for the COVID pandemic. The Colorado budget, as we're looking at it now, is much different than we first started talking about this measure. The legislature was forced to close about a $3 billion deficit, which means that we spread $3 billion of cuts across education, higher education, healthcare, and transportation funding. We anticipate that the way things are looking, the way things are going, that this revenue situation is not going to improve going forward. In fact, the CFI has done work on recessions in the past, and the worst year for state budgets tend to be the year after the beginning of the recession, particularly when federal money isn't still coming. And while the CARES Act helped, we're not sure that there's going to be any more CARES Act as communities across the state face these challenges. The new forecast is suggesting that it's going to be at least another $1.5 to $2 billion more in cuts, while all of the CARES money is gone, and there's a good chance, at least based upon what we're hearing now, that there might not be any more general state aid coming from the federal government. So what's at stake right now? Literally our education system's ability to equip our kids to participate in the economy. Those of you who have children know the challenge of trying to get your kids in a constant learning environment in this particular circumstance. And we just don't know how long this is going to go on. And we're asking our teachers and our school systems to do it with much fewer resources. The other thing that I think is at stake here is our ability to address our historical inequality. My organization, along with Scott's and others, have really been diving deeply into the historic roots of much of the racial bias that we see in our tax system. And we're doing a lot of training and participation with communities to make sure that everybody really understands that. This is an opportunity for us to make a real difference in the structure of our tax system, which is resulting in racially biased outcomes. And regardless of the intent, if it's a racially biased outcome, it is indicative of a structural inequality that can only be faced by policy change. We know that at this point, we cannot cut our way to recovery. And that's why 271 is so important. Scott, you want to take it from here?
Yes, thanks so much, Carol, and thank you so much to the Denver Foundation team for just giving us an opportunity to talk to you all about this effort and everything we've been up to. So, you know, I guess what I would just say as I begin my comments is that for those of you who have been here in the state for a while now, you know that there have been at least 9 different efforts since Tabor passed in 1992 to reform our fiscal system. And I think at the heart of this effort is an understanding, as Carol said, that we've got to do it differently. And she mentioned that as part of our process, we actually did some polling. And I think what that polling shows us is that, you know, you can, as you poll Coloradans, they care about a lot of things. You'll always find a good 30% of Coloradans care about transportation, another 30% care a great deal about the educational inequities that Carol talked about. And so the question for us really was, okay, so what actually unites voters across this state? And what we found overwhelmingly, and we did test a number of different options that maybe we could talk about later on, overwhelmingly, this issue of tax fairness really resonates with the voters. And what we found, and we polled before COVID, and we polled as we were entering the second half of the legislative session in May. And what we found is that nearly 2/3 of Coloradans, 69%, prefer an increase in taxes versus cuts in the state budget. And we tested that a number of different ways. I've also been a part of other polling that had very similar results. And so over the last, say, 3 to 4 months, I've seen 4 polls come in that all seem to show that this issue of tax relief is very resonant for voters, and that it also cuts across party lines with Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliateds really responding to this idea that it's time to create a fairer tax code. Slide, please. Thank you. And so we did our best to try to come up with just that proposal. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So what are we doing here, and why do we think it's so important? So the first thing is that this proposal would raise $2 billion of revenue. Now, that's the Blue Book estimate. That's the estimate that voters will see if it makes the fall ballot. What we actually know is that it will likely raise something less than that, probably something more like $1.7 billion, because there's been obviously changes in the economy. And I think that's why, you know, that sticker shock statement that Carol mentioned, I think is so challenging, because the first line that voters will see is, shall taxes be increased by $2 billion? But what it actually is, when you read just a couple sentences below, is that this cuts income tax for 95% of Coloradans. And we'll talk in a second about how you can do that and what that might say to us about our economy. Half of the revenues would go to our education system. You know, going into the COVID crisis, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Coloradans were deeply upset, and we saw this in polling, about coming 51st in the nation in teacher pay. This was an issue that was deeply resonant. And so we tried our best to design a measure that, you know, that does two things. And for those of you who've been involved in fiscal work, you know, if you go too specific, then the danger, of course, is that people say, well, I don't see myself or my community in this ballot measure, therefore I won't support it. If you go too general, quite the opposite, you say, well, this is just a blank check for government. How can we trust what you'll do with the dollars? So we really did try to strike a balance, using half of the money for very specific K-12 expenses, recruiting, retaining, and paying teachers. And then the other half of the money would go for needs that are related to a growing population and economy. Because again, that's another thing that we've seen in the polling, is people very concerned about the growth in population in the state and our ability to keep up. And so that's how those dollars would be split. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about inequality in our state, tax inequality. And I think that this data is compelling. And there's a couple different versions of this chart. We've seen this data reported by the Colorado Department of Revenue, as well as the Institute for Tax Equity. What's ITEP? What does ITEP stand for? Anyway, there's another organization.
Tax and Economic Policy.
There you go. And so what you're looking at here is total state and local taxes, right? Percentage of income paid when you look at all of the taxes across the board, right? And for me, and I hope for you, this is a concerning chart, because what it's showing is that our low and middle income taxpayers are paying a much greater percentage of their total income than are our wealthiest Coloradans. Why this is, I think, is manifold. But if you really want to affect that, then there's no way to not look at it through the lens of Tabor. Tabor does many things, but one of the things that Tabor does is it very explicitly prohibits different marginal tax rates for different levels of income. Federal income tax, right, has marginal tax brackets. Colorado used to have that in place. They ended it in 1987. And then as of 1992, it has been unconstitutional to have different rates for different levels of income. So people might be paying, you know, sales tax, property tax, but when you accumulate all of those together, this is what we're seeing in terms of share of income. So if we were to do the fair tax proposal, this now is what that chart looks like. So by cutting taxes for 95% of Coloradans and then raising taxes in 3 marginal tax brackets, which I'll go over in a second, we can actually make this chart far more equitable. And I also want to point something else out, which is that there's more to the picture than just what you're paying as a percentage of income. Because for us, what also matters is how adequate that revenue is for supporting public services. And it's our feeling at the Bell, and I know Carol feels the same way, that that when our tax system is not adequate, costs are actually going up for families. The Bell did a report about the middle class in this state, showing that costs like education, early childhood, all of the things that state government touches, those result in higher costs. So not only are people paying more in their income in the tax system than wealthier households are, they generally speaking are the ones incurring the burden of an inadequate tax code. And before we move on to this chart, I think we should all be, I guess, shocked by the fact that if you have taxable income less than $250,000 a year, that puts you in the bottom 95%. And I know that I've talked to a lot of my peers, people who are doing very well, professionals making over $250,000 a year, and genuinely shocked to find out that that puts them in the top 5% of income earners. So I do think that this chart also highlights a little bit about some of the stratification and what income inequality looks like in our state. So let's get to the proposal. All right, let's move forward to this next slide, Carol. I'm going to move a little bit quicker here. So this is what we're proposing. Essentially 3 new tax brackets. You see a tax cut to 4.58% for the bottom 95%. And then for 250 and 500, that amount of money is 7%. From 500 to $1 million, that amount is assessed at 7.75. And then over $1 million is at 8.9. But I would remind you that the effective blended tax rate of all those margins, if you're making $1 million a year, is somewhere around 6.3% total income tax. Next slide. So, I'll just quickly wrap up on the state of the campaign right now. As Carol alluded to, nobody expects a pandemic, and I think COVID really has thrown our campaign for a real loop. I remember before the pandemic, getting ready to launch in a big teachers rally at the state capitol. We were expecting this to be the kind of grassroots effort that we saw in 2018. Obviously, that's all changed. And I think something that's really important is that it is nearly impossible in this state to qualify for the ballot if you're not paying for signatures, at least for some component of your effort. And that signature gathering cost, really exploded just around the time that we had raised about $1 million, $40 per valid signature in the rural areas, which we need to qualify for the ballot. Next slide, please. I think, this campaign is in crunch time. We really are, frankly, in kind of a Hail Mary mode. We've got thousands of activists right now carrying petitions. We're urging them to get as many signatures as possible on those petitions. Those signatures are due on August 3rd. We need 124,000 signatures, but not just bulk signatures. They need to come from the right counties and the right percentages. And so we are dealing with all of those constraints. Next slide. And so I guess what I would just, I think Javier, talked a little bit about the role that he wants the Denver Foundation to play as a civic commons. And I guess what I would say is, I can't tell you today what's going to happen and if we're going to qualify for the ballot. What I do know is that I think we're really onto something. I've watched the fiscal process over the last 20 years, and I really do think this issue of tax fairness is the path to fiscal reform in our state. And so whether or not we qualify for the ballot, and I hope we do, this needs to become a bigger conversation, because there are multiple ways to achieve fairness through the legislative process and in other places. And so what I would encourage you all to do, and I look forward to the dialogue after this, is talk about this. You may not agree that this is the right move, but we've got to get a conversation going in this state about what tax fairness could look like and the role that different people might play in making sure that we have an adequate tax code. So I'll just say, finally, we need your help, not only to talk about the measure. Please sign Initiative 271. If you go onto our website, you see lots of great resources for how to get to a petitioner. Social media, it's just so crucial these days in terms of making sure that this is a viral conversation. And like I said, bring this up at the dinner table, bring this up in your virtual conversations or book clubs, because the more you engage people, I think the more we see that they maybe take down some of the initial barriers, and they really begin to understand why Colorado needs a fairer tax code. So thanks again for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.